apologists often frame the jizya as a peaceful tax that granted non-Muslims exemption from military service. But classical Islamic jurisprudence paints a completely different picture. Let's jump straight to how classical jurists defined the payment process of Surah At-Tawbah, chapter 9, verse 29. I want you to focus on this part of the verse. Classical jurists explicitly define saghirun as حتى يألموا أو يتعبوا, until they feel pain or fatigue. According to this text, the tax could not simply be mailed in. Why? Because remote payment deprives the state of the humiliation required by the verse. The non-Muslim was forced to appear in person, made to stand until exhausted, and physically dragged so they felt pain and fatigue during the transaction. This wasn't fiscal policy. It was ritualized subjugation built directly into the legal framework. When looking at early tafsirs regarding Quran 929, the concept of Ṣaghār, or humiliation, becomes even more explicit. Early commentators and companions described the payment process in terms of clear physical subjugation. Scholars like al-Kalbi noted that the non-Muslims was to be struck on the back of the neck upon paying. Others, like Abu Saleh, stated they were to be violently dragged and pushed while delivering the tax, ensuring the Muslim officials sat while the subject stood humbled. Furthermore, classical authorities like Ibn Abbas made it very clear that this verse explicitly annulled and replaced earlier Quranic verses promoting forgiveness and peaceful coexistence with non-Muslims. This confirms that the tax was directly tied to institutionalized subjugation rather than a mutual civic agreement. Al-Bukhari explicitly defines saghirun as humiliated. Ibn Hajar, the premier commentator on Bukhari, defines it as the humbled, low, and despised. Major jurists like al-Shawkani explicitly ruled that the tax collector must ensure the non-Muslim is kept in a state of physical degradation during payment, forced to walk, made to stand while the collector sits. But scholar al-Naysaburi reveals the real motive behind this protocol. It was intentional psychological warfare. He explains that because human nature naturally rejects humiliation, forcing non-Muslims to endure this embarrassment year after year, this was designed to basically break their spirit and compel them to convert to Islam just to escape this disgrace. It wasn't just a matter of harsh definitions in a dictionary, though. Classical jurists took this theological mandate of humiliation and translated it directly into a binary rule of law: your money or your life. In this classical source, we reach the core philosophy behind jizya as explained by classical scholars without modern revisionism. The text directly asks, why is jizya collected? The answer given is straightforward: because a non-Muslim's life is considered unprotected by default due to their disbelief. The tax is literally the ransom paid to prevent them from being killed. Furthermore, the legal text addresses whether collecting this tax means tolerating non-Muslim faiths. The answer is an explicit no. The scholar explains that jizya was instituted specifically as a form of harassment and punishment designed to make remaining a non-Muslim financially and psychologically unbearable until the person gives up and converts to Islam. In this classical legal manual, we see how humiliation was formally codified into official state law. The text lays out the legal mechanics of the contract clearly. Safety was not a civil right. It was a conditional financial transaction. Non-Muslims are granted safety only so long as they pay the required fee. Again, here the legal text explicitly mandates that non-Muslims must be demeaned during the transaction, forced to stand for prolonged periods, and physically dragged by their hands when handing over the money. The text here notes that if a non-Muslim converts to Islam at the very last second before paying, the tax is instantly cancelled. Why? Because a Muslim cannot be subjected to Ṣaghār, the mandated humiliation. Because the legal framework treated safety as a conditional transaction rather than a basic right, the state engineered a precise face-to-face ritual to remind the subject of that reality every single year. The law also strictly forbids non-Muslims from sending their payment with a representative or paying through an agent. Why? Because the state insisted that every single non-Muslim subject had to show up in person and undergo this ritual of pain and humiliation, face to face. This state-sanctioned degradation wasn't confined to the tax collector's office once a year. The legal apparatus ensured that a non-Muslim's entire public existence, from the clothes on their back to the side of the street they even walked on, it was a continuous display of institutional subjugation and humiliation. Non-Muslims were basically forced to walk on the narrow edges of the streets. Their homes had to be physically marked so people wouldn't pray for them, and Muslims were instructed to force them aside on public paths. When it came time to pay the tax, physical abuse was written into the procedure. The legal manual specifies that the non-Muslim was to be grabbed by the collar, dragged, and violently shaken by the collector while being addressed as, "O enemy of God." The text explicitly states why this verbal and physical violence was used, to remind the subject that this money was paid directly as a ransom for their life. Legal commentaries like Minhat as-Suluk explicitly explain why collectors were instructed to address non-Muslims as "O enemy of God" during tax collection. The text states directly that this verbal insult exists specifically for the purpose of humiliation and degradation, while major Sunni legal schools, including the Hanafis, Malikis, and Hanbalis, instructed the tax collectors to execute the collection in a way that actively degraded the subject. Even schools like the Shafi'is, who avoided physical abuse, maintained that the mandatory humiliation was built into the system itself, defining Ṣaghār as forced submission to living under Islamic law and Sharia. This confirms once again that whether through active physical abuse or compulsory legal subjugation, public degradation was the core intent of the law. Now, modern commentators often attempt to brush these classical rulings aside as mere historical anomalies or a simple civic protection fee, but classical jurisprudence explicitly anticipated and refuted that exact excuse. Here we have scholars directly addressing modern apologists who try to dismiss these abusive practices as outdated history. The scholar insists that degrading non-Muslims is a permanent divine mandate straight from Quran 929. It was a deliberate, institutionalized display of religious supremacy. If you think these brutal protocols remained isolated inside dusty legal manuals, the early historical record shows otherwise. This theoretical framework was implemented at the foundational level of the state under the early caliphs themselves. In this authentic narration from Musannaf Abd al-Razak and Sunan al-Bayhaqi, Aslam, who was the freed slave of Caliph Omar ibn al-Khattab, records how the second caliph managed non-Muslim subjects. While Umar exempted women and children, he instituted a practice of physically stamping or sealing non-Muslim men on their necks upon paying the tax. Lead or clay seals were fastened around their necks as a public badge of submission. This confirms that physical branding and visual marking of non-Muslims was not a late corruption. It was established right at the foundation of the early Islamic State under Caliph Umar himself. Let's also see how the system was a financial extraction and violence operated in practice during the early Islamic conquests. Recorded in Futuh Misr by the early historian Ibn Abd al-Hakam, this passage, when a Coptic leader named Peter was suspected of hiding gold, Amr intercepted his correspondence, uncovered 52 ardebs of minted gold buried under a fountain, an immense fortune worth millions, if not billions, in modern currency, and immediately had Peter beheaded right at the entrance of the mosque. The text explicitly records the result. The native Coptic Christians rushed to hand over all their remaining hidden treasures out of sheer terror that they too would be executed. This was not a voluntary civic tax or a peaceful agreement. It was systematic financial coercion enforced through public execution and state terror. According to historical lexicons citing early historians like al-Baladhuri, the administrative term stamping the dhimmi involved brutal physical marking. Rulers locked lead or copper-sealed metal collars around the necks of non-Muslims. Even more shocking, the text records that authorities used red-hot iron stamps to literally brand the hands of non-Muslim taxpayers as proof of payment. This was human branding, basically. It treated non Muslim subjects not as citizens paying a tax, but as registered assets marked by the state. When you lay out these primary texts side by side, from the core linguistic definitions of Ṣaghār to the legal manuals, administrative protocols, and early conquest records, an unmistakable pattern emerges. The evidence directly contradicts the modern apologetic narrative that jizya was a peaceful, voluntary civic tax for protection. Instead, classic jurisprudence explicitly defines safety as a conditional transaction, treating non Muslim existence as unprotected by default, and using the tax as a literal ransom for survival. The legal framework was systematically engineered around intentional psychological and physical degradation, forcing prolonged standing until pain, dragging hands, locking lead seals onto necks, branding hands with hot irons, and enforcing street segregation, all designed to make remaining a non Muslim unbearable. By framing conversion as the only escape from state sanctioned humiliation, the classical institution of jizya operated not as a mutual civic agreement, but as an engine of financial coercion and religious supremacy. The primary sources demonstrate that public degradation was never an accidental historical abuse, it was the intended, codified mechanics of the law itself.